Hello and welcome to 21st Century Vitalism. This is a podcast exploring how we can best maintain a sense of energy, inspiration, and wakefulness while living with the unique stressors of the modern age. My name is Brett Kane, and I'll be your host on this journey as we take a multidisciplinary look at many of the variables which we need to navigate as we take this work on. This typically brings us in conversation with spiritual teachers, somatic therapists, artists, environmentalists, activists, or really anyone else who comes up on my radar that I feel has a piece to this puzzle. On today's episode, I was fortunate enough to sit down with the founder of the Realization Process, Judith Blackstone. This is a method of embodied psychological and relational healing through non-dual spiritual awakening. Judith has honed in this process with 35 years of private psychotherapy practice and now offers workshops and teacher trainings to guide the next generation of practitioners into this work. She's also the author of several books, including Trauma and the Unbound Body, The Healing Power of Fundamental Consciousness, The Intimate Life, and The Enlightenment Process. Her most recent book, The Fullness of the Ground, A Guide to Embodied Spiritual Awakening, released in the fall of 2023 and is available wherever you get your books. In this conversation, we explore the outline of how the realization process works, namely what non-dual spiritual awakening is and how we can incorporate it into a therapeutic model. It's a conversation that focuses heavily on the themes of embodiment and the nature of constriction, with an introduction to the methods of how we can release those constrictions so that we can be more expansive and expressive. So if you enjoy this conversation and are feeling a charge from Judith's work, I highly encourage you to further check out her materials over at realizationprocess.org. Again, she has all of her books on most online retailers and a slew of other podcast appearances all over the internet, so you can definitely dive in for a couple of weeks. If you want to support this show, consider heading on over to patreon.com/21stcenturyvitalism and becoming a patron. Any little bit helps keep the wheels greased and us ever moving forward. If money's tight, that's okay. You can also subscribe over on YouTube, follow us on Instagram, or like us on Facebook. I am most active on Instagram. I release some writings on there as well, so that is my preference. Without further ado, please sit back, drink some tea, maybe do some stretches, but most importantly, open your heart for Judith Blackstone. Right. Judith, hello. Welcome to the show. We are now live. I just want to start by saying thank you so much for giving me some of your time. I'm sure you're quite busy. How are we doing today? Good. I'm glad to hear it. So as I was telling you before the show, I had recently found your body of work and found it to be so compelling and in line with not only this show, but also my interests as a Buddhist practitioner. And I am always really keen to the people who are combining spirituality with psychotherapy. And I found your approach to just be so unique with the realization process. So I wanted to start off by just kind of bringing in that energy, this notion of non-dual awareness and the way that it can mix with psychotherapeutic intervention. But I'm recognizing that I think a lot of people who are tuning in, I've never really covered non-dual awareness in the show, at least very directly. So to start off, what do we mean?
Non-dual awareness, of course, is going to be defined and described differently by different non-dual teachers. In the realization process, I don't even use the term awareness for non-duality, because when people hear that, they tend to think of just opening the head space, right? And I'll even make this sort of gesture, non-dual awareness. And in the realization process, we open to and realize our own nature as that very, very subtle, undivided consciousness with our whole body and being, right? And so I call it fundamental consciousness because it feels like, when we uncover it, it feels like the foundation of our being and the foundation of all of our external experience at the same time. Now, this consciousness, fundamental consciousness, is experienced as undivided, right? As continuous, unbroken. And that means that when we experience it pervading our body, we experience our own being as whole. We experience our whole being at once. And at the same time, we experience it pervading our environment, so that we experience oneness between our own being and everything around us, the furniture, the people, everything, as if we were all made of that same undivided ground of fundamental consciousness. So, non-duality to me is that simultaneous internal wholeness and that self-other oneness.
So is this is a foundational thing, right? Like this is something that is innate to the experience that we're having, or is this something that we cultivate and build? Or I guess how do we come to that kind of
There's a lot of
realization?
disagreement for centuries and centuries amongst spiritual teachers about that, especially Asian spiritual teachers, about that very theme. But it does seem to be innate. It's something we uncover it. We don't have to create it. So the more in touch with ourselves, the more internal contact we have with ourselves, and here's where it segues into psychotherapeutic work. The more access we have with our internal being, the more that undivided space of fundamental consciousness simply emerges. Right? We uncover it in ourselves rather than cultivating or creating it. Now, it does take some work, and here again I differ with some other non-dual teachers, but I believe and experience that it does take some work of focused inner contact with ourselves in order to uncover it. So in that sense, we can say we cultivate it. It's already there, but it takes some internal cultivation in order to uncover it.
Yeah. So what is it that is kind of obscuring our contact with this? Why is it that we have to work with it and it's not already just immediately present for most people?
Yeah, it's many reasons, but mostly they're psychologically based in reaction to our environment, especially as young children. We constrict ourselves, we modify our responsiveness and our reception of life so as to protect ourselves from being overwhelmed, from being hurt, from experiencing more pain or even just more stimulation than we can tolerate in the moment. So we grow up kind of protected in ourselves, and that's our normal. It's not pathology, it's just the normal human experience. And but it feels to us like who we really are, like this is how much I can feel emotion, this is how much I can think, this is how much I can feel physical pleasure, right? We just grow up getting used to that sort of modification of ourselves. Whereas in fact, as we do certain practices to let go of those constrictions, we find that, oh, there's much more to each of us, much more even to the world around us than we had previously been aware of.
Yeah. So, some people might be hearing you right now and like having this idea that, well, if we evolve to kind of protect ourselves using this kind of individuation, why would we want to kind of challenge that? Wasn't that if it was protective, it must have served a function. So how would you kind of convince somebody who might be a little leery on this, that this actually does have just like a better quality of life to it if they're really comfortable with the sense of duality, so to
Right.
speak?
Of course, if they're really comfortable, they probably won't come to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't get to see people who are really comfortable with that duality.
Yeah.
It's actually not very comfortable after a while. There is a sense that there's more to oneself and to life, and that dawns on many of us who are lucky enough to get there to that awareness. Of course, it does serve an important purpose. In the realization process, we come at this from two directions. We're not just releasing the psychological or the trauma-based constrictions in ourselves. We're not just releasing into air. We do a whole lot of embodiment and self-contact practices before we even get to the release work, the psychological release work. And that means that when we let go, we actually experience deeper contact with ourselves, and that's an experience. So we feel, oh, I haven't just, I'm not just vulnerable, but I actually more in contact with myself, more contained, more self-possessed, more present. So that's a very important part of the work, that we get that contact with ourselves. And also there's two main parts to the embodiment work in the realization process. There's the embodiment itself, the inhabiting the body, the contact with ourselves, the feeling the depth of our love and our intelligence and so forth. And then there's also the core work. We work quite a lot with the subtle core of the body, which is mentioned in many of the Asian techniques as Sushumna in the yogic system, the central channel in Tibetan Buddhism. And that's a very important attunement to ourselves. It's our greatest depth of inward contact with ourselves. And at the same time, it's our portal, our openness into that all-pervasive fundamental consciousness. So by the time we've reached that depth of ourselves, we can feel that letting go of these constrictions is going to be a positive thing. Of course, we're no longer children, right, when we get to this. We're no longer at the mercy of the people in our environment, of our, the bullies at school. So right from the start, we have more choices, more options in order to actually protect ourselves and not have to protect ourselves by limiting ourselves.
Yeah. So one of the things that you had mentioned there, I think was a part of the first point, this idea of making contact with oneself. This was something that I really enjoyed as I was studying up on your platform, this idea of being aware of the body and then like inhabiting the body. So what is it that you mean when you say like making contact? That might be something that's very kind of foreign to a lot of people.
Yes, well, strangely enough, most of us do not live within our bodies, right? We live, in fact, mostly in front of ourselves or even above ourselves. And that's part of our protective mechanism. It's part of the way we learn to relate with other people from the first people we relate to in our lives. We learn to come forward in order to concentrate, in order to feel like we're more in touch with the world around us. Although, in fact, it limits our contact with the world around us. So to make that shift to being within the body is a real difference for most people. People are surprised, I've been everywhere, but I've never really been here before, right within my own body. When we enter into our body, we uncover innate qualities, and again, these are qualities that we don't have to invent or cultivate. We're cultivating the inner attunement with ourselves. But as we do that, these qualities simply arise within us, and they're the qualities of our aliveness. We actually have an ongoing sense of love within our chest, for example, right? We can feel the quality of our voice. We can feel the quality of our intelligence, and so forth. Power, right? So the experience of living within the body is an experience of becoming more and more alive in all of those qualities of our humanness.
Mm-hmm. So is it possible that some of these qualities might be uncomfortable? That's something that I've recognized as I've gone down my mindfulness path, is that, I have moments of where I really recognize brilliance, and it's like, wow, there's some like insight that comes forward that seems to come from nowhere. But then there's also a hyper awareness of the things that are maybe that I don't like so much. So how do you relate to the sensations when you make contact that are a little bit more challenging?
It's a gradual process. It's like a ripening. As we gradually make that internal contact with ourselves, we come into exactly those reasons that we protected against ourselves. We come into the danger, the supposed danger of being powerful, because it evoked the greater power, perhaps, of a parent, right? The punitive power of a parent, right? That's only one possibility, right? So it might feel dangerous to be powerful. We might feel like we're too much, like people are going to be, oh, no, you're too much, because maybe we were too much for our young mother, so forth. So we come into all of those ideas that we've grown up with, right? Don't be so smart, all the things that have been told to us growing up. Well, it turns out, if someone keeps telling you, don't be so smart, you can actually make yourself a little bit less smart. But you can only do it by constricting the body, and that's what's so interesting, right? We can't make ourselves less smart except by slightly contracting within our head. And that means that when we begin to open it, we will come into that, that demand on us not to be so smart. We will come into the idea, perhaps, that people are not going to like my insights and my intelligence. But that's part of the process of resolution that we go through as we do the release. So once again, the release work not only is based on embodiment practices and making deep contact with oneself, but it's also done in the context of dialogue with an empathic, good listener, right? A professional, trained listener who can sit there and be with you and help you come into those ideas and really examine them. Is anyone really going to mind that I'm smart at this point in my life? And we test it out so that we grapple with those ideas, and that's all part of the process.
Yeah. It seems almost as if there's, it's like a multi-layered thing. Like there's the embodiment, but then there's kind of like an intellectual element in the dialogue where it's like you could be having an experience of release, but the mind, I've noticed with this within myself, the mind will kind of get in the way and then like act as like like a gate. It's like the experience kind of flourishes and the mind's like, whoa, got to close that down. It's that old programming.
That's right. That's right. There's definitely a cognitive process to the release work, right? There's really looking at that, what our mind is saying, where it came from. Very often it's not even our own voice that's saying that. It's we call an introjection, right, of a parent's voice or a teacher's voice saying, don't be so powerful, or it's a memory, the memory of having been very open and loving and been hurt, So we'll come in with the idea that, oh, if I feel that much love, I'm going to be hurt again. And that's the natural repercussion, right? That's the natural result of having been hurt, right? We learn, and then we have to unlearn, right? We have to look at that learning and go, well, is that still true? Is it still true? Can I, at this point, have enough self-possession that if I am rejected, I won't be shattered, I won't be devastated by that?
Yeah.
Right? So it's a long and gradual process of cognition, release, and self-contact.
Yeah. So it kind of seems, the way that just landed within me is the sense of like it being a bottom-up approach where you somatically connect to a place that might be blocked, and then the mental stories will flourish and you work with those. But for people who might not have direct access to someone who's somatically focused, is it possible to kind of do a top-down approach where you observe your stories and then you're able to kind of link that to something happening in the body? Or does it usually start as a experience in the body?
It can certainly start either place. The total cognitive therapy has not been that successful. That's what psychoanalysis is. It's a top-down approach, and it's a much longer approach. I'm sure it is successful for some people, But we have noticed that these constrictions in the body really can hang on even when we've noticed them, we know where they're from, and yet the tissues, the fascia tissues, have actually glued together, and they're holding us in that constricted place. So, so the body part is quite important, and it might not release just from the cognitive insight. So both are really necessary. They really need to go together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I'm a manual therapist myself, so I do massage therapy. And, just with talking with people, I feel like there's, as I'm explaining different mechanisms in the body, I really want my clients to have the experience, but I find that like over intellectualization is a lot of people's first response to things. And I could even see as we're talking about non-duality, and this is something from my practice as a Buddhist meditation practitioner, it's so easy to just get caught in the concepts and to convince yourself that there is some sense of understanding. And then I notice years later, it's like you have the experience, you're like, oh, I didn't really understand. So I guess, how do you as a practitioner help people get over that over intellectualization?
Well, we're working through the body, and even the spiritual realization. There is a whole wing of Buddhism, lineage of Buddhism, that works mostly with cognition. But even the Buddhism that I draw on is not not the cognitive aspect of Buddhism. It's the actual meditation and sitting and unfolding and unfolding, unfolding, until there's an actual experience. It's quite unmistakable, that experience, because it's an unusual experience, right? You actually feel that you're made of consciousness, that you're made of clear space. And not only that, even more strange, you actually experience that the world around you is pervaded by that same undivided space of fundamental consciousness. So it's an unmistakable experience. It's not something we can go, maybe I'm understanding that, and imagining it. It's quite different from imagining it.
Yeah. So just a little bit about my practice. I don't know if you can hear all this lawn work happening around me, but I can edit that out. Oh, great. Um, so I study with some people who were students of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And one of the phrases that really helped me kind of understand the whole mechanism of mind was this idea of like basic bewilderment. And that was kind of his way of saying like the way that the mind responds to open space is with a sense of confusion and a sense of like, oh, this is too much space. Is that something that you've heard in like other lineages? Just this notion that the reason we have such thick mind is because space can be kind of uncomfortable. It's like a very groundless kind of quality to it.
I don't think it is uncomfortable once we actually experience it. Of course, people bring all kinds of ideas for not going forward, and one is oh, I'm going to lose myself completely. In fact, we don't lose ourselves completely. We're still there, present. We may feel that we're made of clear fundamental consciousness, but we're still there. In fact, we're more there with our intelligence and our love and even our physical pleasure than we were before. So Trungpa had wonderful ways of describing the spiritual practice, but he was also, he said like to be a bodhisattva is like to be meat for other people, and he went a little bit overboard, and maybe to his own detriment in a way.
Yeah.
But I'm specifically teaching the realization process that we don't just simply vanish into air, that we actually become more embodied, more present at the same time as we transcend our individuality. So I think it's quite important. He also Trungpa had wonderful ways of describing the suchness of life, and the things were really there. And I really appreciated that. Of course, he was one of the first people I ever read. And I actually went to see him a few times 1974.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yes, he was wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is maybe a pretty heady question, but as we're kind of embracing this non-duality, and you're mentioning that you're more there, you're more present. What is like the you that's more present? Like what exactly is left? This indivisible, unitive field. I guess how would you describe that from your experience contacting it?
Well, what's left is your emotional responsiveness, your cognitive insights, your ability to feel pleasure, your contact with the world around you, your ability to enjoy other people, and also your history. You don't suddenly forget, where you were born, where you grew up, who your parents were. All that is still there. Only it's easier to talk about what's not left. What's not left, to the same extent at least, is that sort of knee-jerk reaction to those old patterns. Those dwindle out. The things that we grew up believing, that that the world is sad, that the world is horrifying, or all of that. Those beliefs that we grew up with based on our experience as children, those get re-examined and dispersed, right? So agenda begins to dwindle out, right? I must do this. If I do this, if I say that, this will happen. That begins to dwindle out so that we can really be fresh in each moment, letting things unfold. We become more spontaneous in that way, less calculating.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the difference that occurs.
Yeah. So how do you integrate this into a therapeutic kind of model, I guess, as somebody who has been working for as long as you have in this field? When a client comes to see you and it's maybe their first session, maybe they're familiar with what you do, maybe they're not. How do you begin this kind of work in opening people up to this?
Yeah. Well, I'm actually retired from private practice, but I train people to do this work, and generally we start with dialogue, with beginning to know who that person is and what the main difficulties in their present life, and also the main traumas that they're carrying with them. So we start with dialogue, then we go into the embodiment work, right? The two main practices, especially, we have two main practices in the realization process. The what we call attunement to fundamental consciousness, which is the embodiment, and the attunement to inside and out of that pervasive space, and the core breath. So that needs to be done before the release work, right? But all the time that we're doing that, we know something about the person that they've told us about themselves, right? So we're watching for where they're holding that grief, where they're holding that anger, so that then when we get to the release work, we're right with them as they begin to unfold themselves, right? As they begin to release those trauma-based constrictions. So that's the model of the therapeutic aspect of the work.
Yeah. So, I'd like to dive a little deeper into those two practices that you mentioned, just so people can maybe get a little bit of a taste of kind of what that looks like. You said it was inner attunement and core breathing, right?
Core breath, yes.
Core breath. Okay, so I guess starting with the breath, because that's something that I think is really in vogue right now. How would you describe this core breath kind of practice?
Well, we attune to points within the subtle core of the body. And again, that subtle core of the body is a very subtle channel. We don't know if there's actually a channel there, but there's a location that we can attune to, very subtle, deep attunement to the innermost core of ourselves. And it's actually deeper back than the midline of the body. It's all the way back, as deeply inward as we can focus within ourselves. And in the realization process, we work with three main points: the head center, the heart center, and the pelvic center. But we can actually do the core breath in any of the chakras. And eventually we get to that. But the three main points, so the heart center is the same as the heart chakra in the yogic system, center of the chest, but deep in the core of the body, right? The head center is deep within the center of the head, but a little bit behind the midline. The pelvic center is in the center of the pelvis, but again, as inwardly as we can focus. Finding each of those points, we initiate the breath within the points, and that mixes the breath and the most subtle level of our energy system, right? So that we then begin to feel that we're breathing within the whole internal space of the body. But we start with just breathing within each of the core points, feeling a resonance through the core. So, and then we experience how that opens into, how it's like a doorway into the all-pervasive space. We actually start with the attunement to fundamental consciousness. That's considered exercise 1 in the realization process, because we need to have at least attuned to fundamental consciousness before we can experience how the core points open into it. Now, the attunement to fundamental consciousness, we start with making the shift from being aware of the body to actually living within it. And we can even do that quickly, just if you take a moment to be aware of your hands. And you may notice that you're aware of them from the top down. And now enter into them, right? Live within them. Let yourself feel that you're present within your hands. And then we feel that internal contact everywhere. We start with the feet, we go through the whole body, we attune to those essential qualities of being. And then when we have inhabited the whole body, then we find the space outside. We feel that the space inside and outside is the same. And we attune to the space pervading our own body and the whole world around us. We also have in the realization process relationship exercises for two people to attune to these experiences together so that they can relate to each other as fundamental consciousness and from the innermost core of themselves.
Yeah, I was reading a little bit ago one of your articles and how you mentioned that by inhabiting the body, different parts in the body, you're actually inhabiting that body part's capacities. So like this notion of like the throat and its capacity for speech. And that's something that I've recognized within myself, as I do this podcast. Maybe I was drawn to this because I have had constrictions in the throat, but just how each part of the body has that kind of gate of expression. And I think a lot of people get really closed down. I think one of the major benefits of doing any sort of healing modality is to have a more creative output. I just find that to be a really understated thing. And that was also my thought about like what the chakras are about as well. They each have like a way of interfacing with the world, and by bringing your awareness to them, it opens up those gates so that you can have a more free-flowing energy and just be more interrelated. And
that's again why psychological healing and this advanced spiritual awakening really are the same process. Because the more we know ourselves as that clear space, the more we let go of those constrictions, the freer we are in each of those aspects of ourselves.
Yeah. What do you feel right now, just on like a broad overview of society today? I mean, based on your work, what do you feel is like the thing that more people struggle with than not, in terms of like those body capacities?
I don't know. I live in such a rarefied atmosphere, the people around me. The people who come to the work mostly have the most difficulty living within their pelvis, living within the lower body, experiencing their sexuality, their gender. If they identify with a gender, they can. There's actual equality too. If they can feel if they have a gender. So that aspect, that below the belt, which has been really negated in our society for so long, still lives on, even in the younger generations, to some extent. Some taboo about greeting the world with our whole being instead of just from the waist up.
Yeah. Do you feel like that? I think this is maybe a little too much of a cross pollination, but I'm pretty sure with like the Kundalini practices, they kind of mention how everything rises up. So do you feel like that lower energy center affects the way that we maybe relate with our hearts and our throats? Or do you think that it's blocked there and everything else can be open? Or I guess like what's the relationship between those?
I don't see a real causal relationship in that way. We certainly can be more open, and most people are more open in their heart than in their pelvic center. But we do work with the upward energy coming up through that innermost core of ourselves, and we work with it as an upward current coming up through the legs and through the innermost, the subtle core of the body. And then the lower points need to be open for that, the first chakra, the second chakra, and so forth. But people can be very open, very expanded emotionally without having much contact with themselves sexually.
Yeah. Yeah, that checks out. Yeah. As we're talking about constrictions, I'm realizing that many people might not. I mean, I don't know if I fully understand the notion of constriction. Is that something that's kind of energetic? Or like, where does that meet in the physical body and how does that manifest?
I believe it's the fascia. You know, I don't have scientific proof for that, but I believe it's the fascia. And the fascia is an amazing part of the body that I think is really just beginning to really be well known scientifically. But it surrounds every part of the body, and I believe even every cell, so that we can tighten. By constriction, I just mean tighten. We can tighten ourselves anywhere within the body. Now, Reich, who was one of our first body psychotherapists, Wilhelm Reich, he theorized that people have constrict themselves in like tires around each part of the body. But when we go to inhabit the body and we attune to ourselves on this more subtle level, we realize that we can actually constrict ourselves anywhere within the internal space of the body. And that's why it takes a lot of self-attunement in order even to find these constrictions sometimes, because they're not great big tires. They're just a little bit of shutdown in the heart, tiny bit of shutdown throughout the being. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, as a manual therapist, I am always curious about where my practice kind of lines up with, something like what you're talking about. Is it possible to alleviate some of these constrictions using a manual modality? Or do you feel like the multi-layered approach is maybe just better at that?
I think it's best if people can let go themselves, from within. But to be able to do that can be very much helped by having work done on oneself. Right? Yeah. So that inner contact can certainly be facilitated through body work. I worked with a man many years ago who worked to connect deeply with his mind all the way through the tensions. He did his own version of Rolfing, and I found that extremely helpful. It was in my 20s or early 30s, but that was very helpful for me to then be able to find those places in myself from within.
For me as a massage therapist, I've tried to really lean into the educational realm. I think that if I can use my practice as a means to kind of point people toward things like that, what you're doing, but also as an opportunity, as like a gateway to invite people into their bodies. Because, what I've recognized is that people will go 40, 50 years without ever really contacting themselves. And I think massage is really great as an opportunity. It's kind of like a brick wall for their momentum. They just find themselves on the table and then they're kind of confronted by this entire inner world that they've been kind of ignoring. But I think my biggest struggle is that many people in today's society want to kind of outsource the responsibility to somebody else. They want to just give money and make me better,
Yeah.
So like that desire to actually enact change in oneself and in one's situation, I find to be kind of sometimes like the hardest thing. And I don't know if that's just because it's what I do and most people have that expectation, but yeah, really instilling in people this notion that it's their responsibility. I've noticed seems to be one of the great challenges that I kind of run into.
Yeah. Well, of course, it takes some discipline for people to do it on their own, but if they join a class, then it's not so hard. They can be led through the practices so that they are working themselves to inhabit themselves, but they don't have to make themselves get up and do it all by
Yeah,
themselves.
yeah, yeah. It's amazing how much of this work feels very social. The fact that you emphasize that dialogue was like a huge part of it. I think in the trauma literature, they talk a lot about how healing is kind of a communal thing and you heal in relationship. And I think classes can be really great at that, or just like working with somebody. I feel like for me, a big part of my job is to just kind of be like a sympathetic resonator,
Yeah,
so we're just kind of aligning nervous systems.
yeah.
Um, but, a big reason I do this podcast and talk to folks like you is so that I can kind of slide that under the table as well and be like, hey, I also check these people out.
Sure, sure. No, it's quite important, especially to do healing work with another person who normalizes it, because so often we feel like, oh, no one's ever been through this, what I've been through, and there's this other person going, oh yeah, that's part of our human experience. Yes,
Yeah,
we can be that angry, we can be that sad,
yeah,
that's all part of it.
yeah. So, as people work with you and plug into what you're offering, I guess is there an end goal? Or what is, somebody walks away, they're like, all right, I am finally done with this process. I guess from your experience of working with so many people, what does that look like for people to be on the other side?
Well, to actually know oneself as fundamental consciousness can take a couple of years. It depends where you're starting from. Of course, some people have come to that experience on their own. Uh, Although very often people who've come to it on their own have had it as a peak experience. So the idea that they can actually be there all the time, what the Buddhists call stabilize in the realization, um, does take a little bit of time and a little bit of practice. But we can say that's the goal, although once we know ourselves as fundamental consciousness, we can actually keep on opening to it. We might be able to do that more on our own at some point, but we can, I don't know that we're ever completely open to fundamental consciousness. So that's something we can do for our whole life.
Yeah. So you think it continues to unfold, it continues to change. It's not really like a static state that you're just like, I'm here and that is it. And I feel
Yeah.
like, when I say that, it kind of feels like it would solidify and kind of become rigid and lose the vibrant quality.
Well, fundamental consciousness is quite vibrant, even though it's a stillness. And there is a very definite shift from being in that duality to really knowing oneself as that pervasive space. But even then, we find that we keep finding areas that have been closed to it, that we can open, that we can inhabit more fully, and everywhere that we can inhabit ourselves more fully, we can open to that clear, pervasive space.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. So I kind of went through everything that I was going to bring up today. So I'm okay with closing this off if you are, unless there's anything else that you feel is important in a presentation of this kind of work that we
No,
may
I'm
not have
fine with
covered.
this.
Okay.
This has been
Awesome.
great. Thank you so
Yeah,
much, Brett.
of course. So before we let you go, is there anywhere that people can kind of plug into your work, and how can they best kind of dive deeper into this kind of line of practice?
It's probably best to go to my website, which is realizationprocess.org, and that has everything, the books and the workshops and the teacher trainings.
Amazing. Awesome. All that linked will be down below. So,
Okay,
okay.
thank you, dear.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Judith.
Thank you very much.
All right, that was the episode, everyone. Thank you so much for listening all the way through until the end. Truly do make this show for you. That was Judith Blackstone. You got her website right there, so I'm not going to repeat it. We will be back in 2 weeks with another amazing episode. I'm really excited about the next 5 guests that I have scheduled. So looking like a good fall. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.